The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1876, and it destroyed Thomas Xavier's world with fewer words than it took to order whiskey at the saloon. Miss Penelope Gardner regrets to inform you she cannot fulfill the marriage arrangement due to unforeseen family circumstances. She sends her sincere apologies and wishes you well in your future endeavors. Thomas read those words 5 times before crumpling the paper in his fist, standing alone on the dusty main street of Redding, California, feeling like the biggest fool who ever wore boots. He had spent 6 months corresponding with Penelope, a Boston woman whose letters painted pictures of intelligence, kindness, and a yearning for adventure beyond the suffocating parlors of East Coast society. Her words had given him hope during long nights alone in the small ranch house he had built with his own hands, imagining a future filled with laughter and companionship. He had ordered new furniture from San Francisco, repaired every fence post on his property, and even planted rose bushes near the front porch because she had mentioned loving roses in one of her letters. Now those roses bloomed for nobody, and the furniture sat unused in rooms that echoed with silence. Thomas folded the telegram carefully despite its wrinkled state and tucked it into his vest pocket. At 27 years old, he had survived cattle rustlers, harsh winters, and a bout of fever that nearly killed him 3 years back. But somehow this rejection cut deeper than any of those hardships. He walked slowly toward the general store, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step, trying to compose himself before facing the townsfolk who knew he had been expecting his bride on today's stagecoach. The stagecoach itself rolled into town right on schedule, and Thomas forced himself to watch from across the street as passengers disembarked. An elderly couple, a salesman with too many cases, a cowboy heading north to find work, but no slender woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes as described in the photograph she had sent. The photograph now felt like a taunt sitting on his mantel at home. "Sorry to hear about your news, Xavier," said Walter Hopkins, the telegraph operator, approaching with genuine sympathy in his weathered face. "Real shame when these arrangements do not work out." Thomas nodded stiffly, not trusting his voice to remain steady. He tipped his hat and continued walking, needing space and solitude more than sympathy. He headed straight for his horse, tied outside the saloon, and rode hard back to his ranch, 5 miles outside of town, where at least the cattle would not look at him with pity. The following weeks passed in a blur of routine. Thomas threw himself into work, rising before dawn to tend his herd, mending fences that did not need mending, and avoiding town except when absolutely necessary. His ranch, modest but profitable, raised quality cattle that fetched good prices in San Francisco. He had built something solid here in the Northern California territory, but without someone to share it with, the accomplishment felt hollow. October brought cooler weather and the first rains of the season. Thomas sat on his porch one evening, watching dark clouds gather over the distant mountains, when his neighbor rode up. Jacob Morrison owned the adjacent property and had become the closest thing Thomas had to a friend since moving to Redding 4 years ago. "You are killing yourself with this brooding," Jacob said without preamble, dismounting and tying his horse to the rail. "It has been a month. Come to the dance at the church hall on Saturday." "Not interested," Thomas replied, taking a sip from his coffee. "There are other women in the world besides some Boston lady who changed her mind. I do not want other women. I want to be left alone." Jacob sat down on the porch steps, ignoring the dismissal. "My Sarah is worried about you. Says you are looking thin. She sent over a pie." Despite his dark mood, Thomas felt a flicker of warmth at the kindness. Sarah Morrison was a good woman who treated him like the brother she never had. Thank her for me. Thank her yourself. Come to dinner tomorrow. Jacob. It is not a request, Xavier. Sarah will ride over here herself if you refuse, and she is 8 months along with the baby. You want that on your conscience. Thomas allowed himself a small smile, the first in weeks. Fine. Tomorrow, 6 o'clock. Do not be late. As October turned to November, Thomas slowly rejoined the living. He attended church on Sundays, helped Jacob with a barn raising, and even went to the dance, though he left early without asking any woman to partner with him. The wound was healing, scabbing over into scar tissue that he could live with if not forget. He stopped checking the mail with desperate hope and started sleeping through the nights again. The rosebushes near his porch bloomed one last time before winter, and he did not cut them down in spite as he had considered doing. They were beautiful, and beauty did not need justification. November brought a cold snap that had the ranchers worried about their herds. Thomas spent long days moving cattle to lower pastures and reinforcing shelters against the wind that swept down from the mountains. On a Tuesday afternoon, he rode into town to pick up supplies and check if the feed shipment from Sacramento had arrived. The general store was crowded with other ranchers stocking up before the weather worsened. Thomas waited his turn, exchanging pleasantries about cattle prices and rainfall amounts, when the door opened and a woman walked in who made the entire room fall silent. She was travel-worn and dusty, her dark blue dress creased from long hours of sitting, her face pale with exhaustion. She carried a single carpet bag and looked around the store with wide eyes that seemed too large for her delicate face. Her dark hair was pinned up, but strands had escaped to frame her face, and even in her disheveled state she was striking. "I am looking for Thomas Xavier," she said, her voice carrying a distinct Boston accent. "I was told he might be in town." Thomas felt his heart stop. He knew that voice from his imagination, from reading her letters aloud to himself in the evenings. He knew those eyes from the photograph he had studied until every detail was memorized. "Penelope," she turned toward him, and her face transformed with relief. "Thank God. I was beginning to think I would never find you." The store erupted in whispers, but Thomas heard none of it. He crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides, stopping just short of touching her, unsure if she was real or some cruel mirage born of wishful thinking. "You sent a telegram," he said, his voice rough. "You said you could not come." "I know," she said, and tears welled in her eyes. "I know what I said, and I know it has been 3 months, and I know I have no right to show up here expecting anything, but I had to come. I had to see if what I felt through your letters was real." Thomas became aware of their audience, every person in the store watching this reunion with fascination. "Come on," he said gruffly, picking up her carpet bag. "Let us talk somewhere private." He led her outside to where his horse was tied, very aware of the curious faces pressed against the store window. Penelope followed without protest, wrapping her arms around herself against the November chill. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his mind racing to catch up with this impossible reality. "Starving. The stagecoach only stopped twice and the food was awful. There is a restaurant. It is not fancy, but it is clean and the food is good." She nodded and he offered his arm. She took it hesitantly, and even through the layers of fabric he could feel her trembling. Whether from cold, exhaustion, or nerves, he could not tell. The restaurant was mercifully quiet, most folks still at work or home preparing dinner. Thomas secured a corner table and ordered coffee, stew, and fresh bread. Penelope sat across from him, and in the better light, he could see the shadows under her eyes and the worry lines creasing her forehead. "Start from the beginning," he said once the coffee arrived. "Tell me everything." Penelope wrapped her hands around the warm cup, gathering her thoughts. "When I first answered your advertisement, My father was alive. He encouraged me to seek my own happiness, to find adventure if that was what my heart needed. But 2 weeks before I was supposed to board the train west, he took ill. Pneumonia. The doctor said he had perhaps a month to live. Thomas felt his anger at her defection soften slightly. I am sorry. I could not leave him. I sent the telegram because I thought it was the right thing to do, to release you from our arrangement so you could find someone else. My father lingered longer than expected, but he finally passed in late October. Her voice cracked, and she paused to compose herself. Before he died, he made me promise that I would not let fear keep me from living. He said I had been writing to you with such joy in my eyes, and he wanted me to at least meet you before giving up on the possibility. So you came. I sold everything I could, packed one bag and bought a ticket on the next train west. I know it is presumptuous. I know you probably hate me for the telegram and the months of silence. I know you may have found someone else in that time, but I had to try. I had to see if what I felt through your letters could become something real. The food arrived, and Penelope ate with single-minded focus, suggesting she had not had a proper meal in days. Thomas watched her, trying to reconcile this real, flawed, complicated woman with the idealized version he had built in his mind from her letters. I did not find someone else, he said when she finally pushed away her empty bowl. I was angry, hurt, but I did not even look at another woman. Hope flickered across her face. Truly, your photograph is still on my mantle. I could not bring myself to put it away. She reached across the table tentatively, and after a moment's hesitation, he took her hand. Her fingers were slender and cold, nothing like the work-roughened hands of the ranch women he knew, but her grip was firm. I do not expect anything, she said quickly. I do not expect you to marry me just because I showed up. I do not even know if we will suit each other in person, but I would like the chance to try. I have enough money to rent a room in town for a few weeks. We could court properly, see if this feeling between us is real or just the product of loneliness and distance. Thomas considered her words carefully. Everything she said made sense, and yet his heart was already racing ahead, already seeing her in his house, at his table, sharing his life. But she was right to urge caution. Letters were one thing, but living together, building a life together, required more than pretty words on paper. There is a boarding house run by Mrs. Chen, he said finally. She is a respectable widow who takes in boarders. She will give you a fair rate and look after you properly. You can stay there while we get to know each other. Relief flooded Penelope's face. Thank you. Thank you for not sending me away immediately. I would be lying if I said I was not still hurt by that telegram, Thomas admitted. But I understand why you sent it. Family comes first. I would have done the same in your position. They talked until the restaurant owner started giving them pointed looks about closing for the evening. Thomas paid for the meal and led Penelope to the boarding house, carrying her single bag. Mrs. Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had come to California during the gold rush with her late husband, looked Penelope over with frank assessment. You are the bride who sent the telegram, she said, not bothering with pretense. I am Penelope Gardner from Boston, Penelope replied, meeting her gaze steadily. I need a room and I can pay. Can you cook? Yes, madam. Clean? Yes. I run a respectable house. No men in your room, no drinking, and you help with breakfast for the other boarders. That seems fair. Mrs. Chen named a price that made Thomas wince, but Penelope agreed without haggling. Money would be tight for her, he realized. She had sold everything for a ticket west and a few weeks' rent. If things did not work out between them, she would be stranded in California with no family and few resources. I will pick you up at 10 tomorrow morning, Thomas said at the door to the boarding house. There is a church social. Good way for you to meet people. I would like that. They stood awkwardly for a moment, neither sure how to say goodbye. Finally, Thomas tipped his hat. Sleep well, Penelope. You too, Thomas. He rode home through the darkness, his mind whirling. Penelope was here, real and solid, not just words on paper. She was brave and stubborn, traveling across the country alone to chase a possibility. She was grieving her father, displaced from everything familiar, taking an enormous risk on a man she had never met. And she was absolutely beautiful, even exhausted and dusty from travel. Thomas could not sleep that night. He cleaned his house top to bottom, shaved carefully in the morning, and put on his best shirt and vest. He arrived at the boarding house at 9:45, too nervous to wait any longer. Penelope came downstairs wearing a different dress, this one a soft green that brought out the color in her eyes. Her hair was properly pinned, and the shadows under her eyes had faded slightly after a good night's rest. "You look beautiful," he said before he could stop himself. She blushed, a rosy color spreading across her cheeks. "You look very handsome yourself." The church social was in full swing when they arrived. Families gathered under the large oak trees near the white clapboard church. Children ran screaming between the adults, and long tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family in the congregation. Thomas felt every eye turn toward them as they approached. He kept his hand at the small of Penelope's back, a gesture of protection and claim. Sarah Morrison descended on them immediately, her pregnant belly leading the way. "You must be Penelope. Oh, I am so glad you came after all. Thomas has been absolutely miserable." "Sarah," Thomas warned. "Well, you have been," she said, unrepentant. She linked arms with Penelope, drawing her away from Thomas toward a group of women. "Come meet everyone. They are dying of curiosity but are too polite to swarm you." Thomas watched Penelope go, saw her straighten her spine and lift her chin as she prepared to face the scrutiny of the community. She had courage, he had to give her that. Jacob appeared at his elbow with 2 glasses of lemonade. "So she actually came. How do you feel about it?" Thomas considered the question honestly. "Confused, hopeful, terrified. That sounds about right for love." "It is too soon to call it love." "Is it?" Jacob took a sip of his lemonade, watching the women cluster around Penelope. "You built her a house, planted roses, spent 6 months writing letters, mourned her like a widow when she canceled. That sounds like love to me." "I loved an idea," Thomas corrected. "I do not know if I love her yet." "Fair enough. But you want to." That was true enough that Thomas did not bother denying it. The afternoon passed pleasantly. Penelope charmed the church ladies with her manners and self-deprecating humor about her journey west. She played with the children, helped serve food, and asked intelligent questions about ranching and life in California. Thomas watched her integrate herself into the community and felt his heart open further despite his attempts at caution. As the sun started to set and families began packing up to head home, Thomas found himself alone with Penelope near the edge of the gathering. She looked happy but tired, the social energy required to meet so many new people clearly draining. "Would you like to see the ranch?" he asked. "It is not far and I can have you back to the boarding house before full dark." "I would love to see it." They rode together on his horse, Penelope sitting in front of him in the saddle, his arms around her to hold the reins. The intimacy of the position was not lost on either of them. She fit perfectly against his chest, and he could smell the lavender soap she had used that morning. The ranch appeared in the golden light of late afternoon, the house and outbuildings looking better than they ever had, with the sun painting everything warm and welcoming. Thomas had built the house himself over the course of 2 years, choosing each log carefully, crafting it to withstand the harsh winters and hot summers. "It is beautiful," Penelope breathed as they approached. "Your letters did not do it justice." He helped her down from the horse and showed her around, pointing out the barn, the chicken coop, the fenced pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. She asked questions about everything: how many head of cattle, what he grew in the garden, where the water came from. Finally, they reached the house itself. Thomas hesitated at the door. "It would not be proper for you to go inside without a chaperone." "I know," she said, "but may I peek through the window? I want to see what you built." He showed her the windows, pointing out the main room with its fireplace and furniture from San Francisco, the kitchen with its iron stove, the bedroom he had prepared for her that stood empty and waiting. "The rose bushes," she said suddenly, walking to the front porch. "You actually planted them. You said you loved roses." She touched the thorny branches gently, though no blooms remained this late in the season. When she turned back to face him, tears streamed down her face. "I do not deserve this," she said. "I do not deserve you waiting for me or keeping my photograph or planting roses. I sent that telegram and broke your heart, and you should have moved on." Thomas crossed to her, unable to maintain distance in the face of her tears. "You did what you had to do for your family. There is no shame in that. I could have written again. I could have explained instead of just sending that cold telegram. But I was overwhelmed with my father's illness and my mother's grief, and I convinced myself it was kinder to make a clean break. I was a coward." "You were a daughter taking care of her dying father," Thomas said firmly. He reached out and brushed tears from her cheeks with his thumbs, the first time he had touched her face. Her skin was soft and damp, and she leaned into his touch like a flower seeking sun. "And then you were brave enough to come west anyway, even knowing I might turn you away." "That is not cowardice." "Thomas," she whispered, and the way she said his name made his heart clench. "I want to kiss you," he said honestly. "But I think we should wait. I think we should do this properly, take our time, make sure this is real." "You are right," she said, but she sounded disappointed, which pleased him more than it should have. He took her hands instead, holding them between his own. "Come to dinner tomorrow. I will pick you up at 5 and we will eat at the restaurant again. We will talk more, learn about each other beyond what we wrote in letters." "I would like that very much." They rode back to town slowly, neither wanting the day to end. Thomas left her at the boarding house with a promise to return the next evening, then rode home through the gathering darkness with his heart lighter than it had been in months. Thus began a courtship that had the whole town talking. Thomas came to town nearly every day, and when he could not, he sent notes via riders heading into Reading. He and Penelope had dinner together 4 times a week, took long walks around town, and attended every social gathering as a pair. She told him about Boston, about the suffocating expectations of society there, the endless rules about who could speak to whom and what topics were appropriate for young ladies. She described her father's bookshop, and how she had spent her childhood reading everything she could get her hands on, developing opinions that polite society deemed unladylike. He told her about building the ranch from nothing, about the loneliness of the first years when he nearly gave up and returned east. He described the satisfaction of watching cattle he had raised fetch good prices, of building something with his own hands that would last. 3 weeks into their courtship, Sarah Morrison went into labor. Jacob rode hard to the ranch, finding Thomas mending fence in the north pasture. "The baby is coming, and Sarah is asking for Penelope," he said, his face pale with worry. "The doctor is there, but Sarah wants another woman with her, and she specifically asked for Penelope." Thomas and Jacob rode to town together, picking up Penelope at the boarding house before racing to the Morrison ranch. The doctor met them at the door, a tired-looking man in his 60s who had delivered half the babies in the county. "First babies take time," he said. Could be hours yet, but she is doing fine, and having another woman to help will ease her mind. Penelope went inside without hesitation, rolling up her sleeves. Thomas and Jacob were banished to the porch where they paced and worried as men had done since the dawn of time. "I hate this," Jacob said, running his hands through his hair for the 100th time. "I hate that she is in pain and I can do nothing." "She is strong," Thomas said, trying to sound confident. "She will be fine." The sun set and rose again before they finally heard the thin wail of a newborn. Jacob nearly broke down the door in his haste to get inside. The doctor met him with a weary smile. "You have a son, big, healthy boy," and Sarah came through like a champion. Jacob disappeared into the bedroom while Thomas waited in the main room. Penelope emerged 20 minutes later, exhausted but glowing. Her dress was rumpled, her hair falling loose from its pins, and she had never looked more beautiful. "A boy," she said, sinking into a chair. 8 pounds at least. He has Jacob's nose. "How is Sarah?" "Tired but happy." "She is amazing, Thomas. I have never seen such strength." He sat beside her, taking her hand. "Thank you for being here for her." "Of course. She has been so kind to me since I arrived." They sat in comfortable silence until Jacob emerged, cradling a tiny bundle in his arms with the expression of a man who had just discovered religion. "Thomas, Penelope, meet James Thomas Morrison." "You used my name?" Thomas asked, stunned. "You are his godfather," Jacob said, "assuming you will accept." Of course I accept." Penelope stood to look at the baby, cooing softly at his red face and tiny fists. The sight of her holding the baby, looking down with such tenderness, made Thomas's chest ache with longing. They walked back to town as dawn broke over the mountains, exhausted and happy. Thomas walked her to the boarding house door, both too tired for much conversation. "Today showed me something," Penelope said before going inside. "It showed me what it means to build a life here, to be part of a community. I want this, Thomas. I want to stay in Reading to make this my home, even if things do not work out between us." "I hope desperately that they do work out," she said frankly. "But even if they do not, I cannot go back to Boston. There is nothing for me there anymore. Here I feel like I can breathe." "Then stay," he said simply. "Whatever happens between us, I will make sure you are looked after." She kissed his cheek, a brief press of lips against his skin that sent electricity through his body. "You are a good man, Thomas Xavier." December arrived with cold rain and occasional snow in the higher elevations. Thomas's courtship of Penelope continued, growing deeper and more comfortable as they learned each other's rhythms and quirks. She had a quick wit that caught him off guard and made him laugh. He had a dry sense of humor that she found endlessly amusing. On Christmas Eve, the church held a candlelight service followed by a community dinner. Thomas picked up Penelope early, wanting time alone with her before the crowds. "I have something for you," he said as they walked slowly toward the church. The streets were quiet, most families already gathering for the celebration. He handed her a small wrapped package. She opened it carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal and a beautiful fountain pen. "You mentioned in one of your early letters that you loved to write," he said. "I thought you might want to record your impressions of California, of your new life here." "Thomas, this is too much," she protested, but her eyes shone as she ran her fingers over the smooth leather. "I have something else," he said, suddenly nervous. He pulled a small box from his pocket, and when he opened it, a simple gold band gleamed in the fading light. Penelope gasped. "I know we have only been courting for 6 weeks," Thomas said quickly. "I know it is fast. But I have known you through letters for much longer than that, and these past weeks have only confirmed what I suspected from your very first letter. You are everything I want in a partner. You are intelligent and brave and kind. You make me laugh. You fit into this community like you were born here. And I love you, Penelope Gardner. I love you with everything I am." "Thomas," she breathed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow," he continued. "I am asking if you will consider becoming my wife. We can have a long engagement if you want, give you time to be absolutely sure, but I want you to know my intentions. I want you to know that I am committed to building a life with you." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you. And I do not need a long engagement. I love you too, Thomas. I have loved you since your third letter when you described watching the sunset over your land and wishing you had someone to share it with. That is when I knew you were not just looking for a wife, but for a partner." He slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and then he finally kissed her. She tasted like peppermint and felt like coming home. The kiss started gentle but deepened quickly, months of longing and restraint pouring into it. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "How long an engagement?" he asked. "Is January too soon?" "January is perfect." They announced their engagement at the Christmas dinner to the surprise of absolutely no one. The community had been waiting for Thomas to propose since Penelope first arrived. Sarah Morrison cried happy tears while bouncing baby James on her shoulder. Mrs. Chen harumphed and said it was about time. The Reverend offered to perform the ceremony whenever they were ready. They set the date for January 15th. Giving Penelope time to sew a proper wedding dress with help from the church ladies and Thomas time to finish the final touches on the house. He added curtains to the windows, put up shelves for her books, and brought in more furniture to make the house truly a home. The weeks before the wedding passed in a flurry of activity. Penelope spent her days sewing and planning, her evenings with Thomas talking about their future. They discussed everything from how many children they wanted to how they would run the ranch together to what they would plant in the spring garden. "I want to help with the ranch," Penelope said one evening as they sat in the restaurant, lingering over coffee. "Not just the house and garden, but the actual running of it. I want to learn about the cattle, help with the books, be a true partner." "That would make me very happy," Thomas said honestly. "I never wanted just a housekeeper. I wanted someone to build this life with me. I may not be very good at it at first. Neither was I. I am a carpenter's son from Pennsylvania. I learned ranching by making every mistake possible. You will learn too." On January 14th, the night before the wedding, Penelope had her final dinner with Thomas as an unmarried woman. They sat across from each other at their usual table, but the conversation was more subdued than normal. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "Not about marrying you, I am certain about that, but about everything changing tomorrow. About leaving the boarding house and starting my new life. About being responsible for a home and eventually children. It is a lot." "We will figure it out together," he promised. "And you do not have to do everything at once. We will take it one day at a time. What if I am a terrible ranch wife?" "Impossible. You are good at everything you try." "What if you get tired of me?" He reached across the table and took both her hands. "Penelope, I waited 27 years to find you. I am not going to get tired of you. I am going to wake up grateful every single day that you were brave enough to get on that train west." She smiled, some of the tension leaving her face. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes. I know the feeling." The wedding took place at noon on a clear, cold January day. The church was packed with what seemed like everyone in Redding and the surrounding ranches. Penelope walked down the aisle alone, having no father to give her away, but she walked with her head high, and her eyes locked on Thomas waiting for her at the altar. She wore a dress of cream-colored silk that the church ladies had helped her sew, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her dark hair was pinned up with small flowers woven through it. She looked like an angel, and Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion as she approached. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows in steady voices, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life brought. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her thoroughly, to the delight of the congregation. The church hall had been transformed for the reception, tables laden with food and a small area cleared for dancing. Jacob played fiddle while other musicians joined in with guitars, and a piano someone had dragged over from the saloon. Thomas and Penelope opened the dancing, swaying together as the community clapped and cheered. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Xavier?" Thomas murmured in her ear. "Like everything I have been searching for my whole life," she replied. They danced until the sun set, ate until they were stuffed, and accepted congratulations from what felt like hundreds of people. Finally, as the party showed no signs of slowing, they slipped away to the wagon Thomas had decorated with ribbons and bells. The ride to the ranch was quiet, both of them tired but happy. When they arrived, Thomas lifted Penelope from the wagon and carried her over the threshold, tradition demanding no less. The house was warm, a fire already burning in the fireplace thanks to Jacob, who had ridden out earlier. Candles were lit throughout the rooms, casting soft golden light. Penelope looked around with wonder, seeing her new home properly for the first time. "Welcome home," Thomas said, setting her gently on her feet. "It is perfect," she said, turning in a slow circle. "Absolutely perfect." They spent their first night as husband and wife, learning each other, talking and kissing and holding each other close. Thomas was gentle and patient, and Penelope was brave and loving. When they finally fell asleep as dawn broke, they were tangled together, already unable to imagine sleeping any other way. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Penelope had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, rising before dawn to help with breakfast and the endless chores that came with running a household in 1877. She learned to cook on the iron stove, to preserve food for the winter, to tend the chickens and collect eggs. Thomas taught her about the cattle, how to recognize illness, when to move them to different pastures. She had a natural head for the business side of things and started keeping the ranch books with meticulous precision. She also started a small garden, planning for spring planting with an ambition that made Thomas smile. They had their first fight in March over something stupid. He could not even remember what. Penelope had fled to the bedroom in tears, and Thomas had stomped around the barn for an hour before realizing he was being an idiot. He found her sitting on the bed, eyes red but no longer crying. "I am sorry," he said from the doorway. "I was being stubborn." "I was being difficult," she countered. "Can we agree we were both being difficult, stubborn idiots and move on?" She laughed despite herself. "Yes, I think that is fair." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "I do not know how to do this perfectly. I am going to make mistakes." "So am I, but we will figure it out together." "Together," he agreed. April brought the spring rains and with them, good grass for the cattle. Thomas hired 2 hands to help with the increased workload, young cowboys who bunked in the small cabin he had built behind the barn. Penelope fed them breakfast and dinner, learning to cook for a crew instead of just 2 people. One evening in late May, Penelope came out to where Thomas was working in the barn and stood watching him groom his horse. He looked up and found her smiling at him with an expression he could not quite read. "What?" he asked. "I have news." Something in her tone made his heart race. "What kind of news?" "I am pregnant. The baby should come in January." Thomas dropped the brush he was holding. For a moment he could not speak, could not breathe. Then he crossed to her and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "Careful, you will make me sick," He set her down gently, his hands moving to her still flat stomach. A baby. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy? Happy. Penelope, I am over the moon. I am terrified and excited and grateful and every other emotion at once. She covered his hands with her own. Me too. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Penelope bloomed with health, her skin glowing and her energy boundless, despite the growing swell of her belly. She continued helping with the ranch work until Thomas and the hired hands insisted she take it easier. You are all being ridiculous, she protested when they would not let her help move cattle in September. I am pregnant, not made of glass. Humor us, Thomas said. Please. She grumbled but agreed, focusing her energy on preparing the house for the baby. She sewed tiny clothes, washed and rewashed the cradle Thomas built, and planned obsessively for every possible scenario. In December, Sarah Morrison came to stay at the ranch, leaving baby James with Jacob so she could help Penelope through the final weeks of pregnancy and the birth. The two women had become close friends, and Penelope was grateful for her calm, experienced presence. The baby came on a snowy night in mid-January, 1 year almost to the day after the wedding. Labor started in the evening and continued through the long hours of darkness. Thomas paced holes in the porch while Sarah coached Penelope through the contractions. When dawn broke, the cry of a newborn finally split the air. Sarah emerged from the bedroom with a huge smile. You have a son, she said. A big, healthy, perfect son. Thomas went to Penelope, finding her propped up in bed looking exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle against her chest. She looked up at him with so much love in her eyes that he felt his own fill with tears. Meet your son, she said. The baby had a tuft of dark hair and a scrunched-up red face. He was the most beautiful thing Thomas had ever seen besides his wife. What should we name him? Penelope asked. I thought we agreed on Peter if it was a boy. Peter Gardner Xavier, she said, testing the name. I like it. Thomas held his son for the first time, marveling at how something so small could be so perfect. Peter fussed and waved tiny fists, already making his opinions known. He has your stubbornness, Thomas said. He has your nose, Penelope countered. The months after Peter's birth were sleepless and wonderful. Thomas had never known exhaustion like this, but he had never known joy like this either. He would wake in the night to Penelope feeding the baby by candlelight and feel his heart so full he thought it might burst. Spring came again, and with it, the endless cycle of ranch work. But now Thomas had Penelope working beside him on the business end and Peter gurgling in a basket nearby. His small family was growing and the house felt truly like a home. In May, a telegram arrived that made Penelope pale. Thomas took it from her shaking hands and read that her mother had passed away in Boston. Penelope grieved quietly, crying at night in Thomas's arms for the mother she would never see again, for the reconciliation that would now never happen. She never forgave me for coming west, Penelope said one night. She thought I was abandoning the family, choosing you over her. You were choosing your own happiness, Thomas said. That is not abandonment. I wish she could have met Peter. I wish she could have seen that I made the right choice. I am sorry, Thomas said, because there was nothing else to say. But Penelope was resilient, and she channeled her grief into loving her family even more fiercely. She threw herself into ranch life, into raising Peter, into being the best partner she could be to Thomas. Summer brought a drought that had the ranchers worried. Water became scarce, and Thomas had to make the difficult decision to sell off some of the herd before they ran out of grazing land entirely. It was a financial hit, but Penelope's careful management of their savings meant they weathered it better than some of their neighbors. We will rebuild, she said, going over the books with him one evening. The drought will break eventually, and we will buy more cattle when the time is right. How did I get so lucky to marry such a smart woman? You posted a very compelling advertisement, she said with a smile. That autumn, Jacob and Sarah announced they were expecting another child. The two families celebrated together, their lives increasingly intertwined. Peter and young James played together while the adults worked, a second generation already forming bonds. Winter brought rain at last, breaking the drought and turning the brown hills green again. Thomas stood on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, with Penelope beside him and Peter playing at their feet. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Giving up Boston and everything you knew to come here?" She looked at him like he was crazy. "Not for a single second. This is where I was meant to be. With you, raising our family, building this life. I have never been happier. Even with the drought and the hard work and the isolation. Especially with all that. I am living, really living in a way I never did back east. I am using my mind and my hands and every part of me. And I am doing it with a partner who respects and loves me. How could I regret that?" He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I love you." "I love you too." The years passed, each bringing its own challenges and joys. The ranch prospered under their joint management, growing from a modest operation into one of the most successful in the region. Penelope's business acumen combined with Thomas's ranching knowledge proved an unbeatable combination. Peter grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed Thomas everywhere, already fascinated by the cattle and horses. In the spring of 1879, Penelope announced she was pregnant again. This time the baby came easily, a daughter they named Patricia Grace Xavier. "Now we have one of each," Penelope said, cradling their dark-haired daughter. "Our family is perfect, but the universe had other plans." 2 years later, another son arrived, followed 2 years after that by another daughter. The house that had once seemed too large for one lonely man was now bursting with children, noise, and laughter. Through it all, Thomas and Penelope's love only deepened. They learned each other's moods and rhythms so well they could communicate with just a look. They worked together seamlessly, whether managing the ranch, raising the children, or simply sitting together on the porch after the little ones were asleep. When Peter turned 10 in 1887, Thomas started teaching him the ranching business in earnest. The boy took to it naturally, inheriting his father's skill with animals and his mother's head for numbers. The younger children also helped according to their abilities, the ranch becoming a true family operation. Penelope expanded her interests beyond the ranch, starting a lending library in town and teaching reading to children whose parents could not afford formal schooling. She became a pillar of the community, respected for her intelligence and kindness. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas took Penelope to San Francisco for a week, leaving the children with Jacob and Sarah. They stayed in a fancy hotel, ate in restaurants, saw a play at the theater. It was wonderful and exciting, but both were happy to return home to their children and the ranch. 10 years, Penelope said on the train home. It feels like 10 minutes and 10 lifetimes all at once. Any regrets? Just one, she said, and his heart clenched until she continued. I regret that telegram. I regret the 3 months we lost because I was too much of a coward to explain things properly in writing. If I could go back, I would have written you a long letter explaining everything instead of just that cold message. But you came anyway, Thomas reminded her. 3 months later, you were brave enough to come. That is what matters. I almost did not, she confessed. I stood at the train station in Boston with my ticket in hand, and I almost turned around and went home. I was so afraid you would reject me, that I had ruined everything. What made you get on the train? my father's voice in my head, telling me that fear was no reason to give up on happiness. And my own heart, telling me that you were worth the risk. Thomas took her hand, the gold band she had worn for 10 years glinting in the sunlight streaming through the train window. Best risk I ever took was posting that advertisement. Best risk I ever took was answering it. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and the years continued their steady march forward. There were hard times, a bad winter in 1889 that killed some of the herd, a bout of illness that swept through the family in 1891, leaving everyone weak but alive. But the good times far outweighed the bad. Peter grew into a strong, capable young man who clearly would take over the ranch someday. Patricia became a teacher, following in her mother's footsteps with the passion for education. The younger children were still finding their paths, but all of them knew they were loved and supported. On a spring evening in 1895, Thomas and Penelope sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had done countless times before. Their hair was starting to show gray now, and their hands bore the marks of 20 years of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they saw the same people who had fallen in love through letters and built a life through determination and love. "You remember that first day you arrived?" Thomas asked. "Walking into the general store looking like you had been through a war." Penelope laughed. "I remember being so terrified you would take one look at me and send me away. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, even covered in dust." "Liar." "Truth," he insisted. "You were beautiful because you were brave. Because you came all this way on faith and hope." She leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable and content. "It was the best decision I ever made." From inside the house came the sounds of their younger children arguing over something trivial, Patricia calling for peace, Peter's deeper voice joining the fray. The sounds of family, of life, of home. "We did good," Thomas said. "We did very good," Penelope agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the California sky in brilliant colors. The ranch stretched out before them, the cattle settling for the night, the hired hands heading to the bunkhouse, smoke rising from the chimney of their warm, full house. 20 years ago, Thomas had been a lonely man building a life in the wilderness, hoping for someone to share it with. 20 years ago, Penelope had been a grieving daughter taking a desperate chance on a man she knew only through letters. Now they were partners, parents, pillars of their community. They had built something lasting and good, a legacy that would continue through their children and beyond. "I love you," Penelope said, the words as familiar as breathing but no less meaningful for their frequency. "I love you too," Thomas replied, kissing her temple gently. The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The wind carried the scent of grass and cattle and the promise of rain. This was home. This was happiness. This was the life they had built together from nothing but hope and determination and love. And it was everything they had ever dreamed it could be. Years continued to unfold like the pages of a well-loved book. The turn of the century brought changes to Redding and the surrounding areas, but the Xavier Ranch remained constant, a testament to hard work and family bonds. Peter married in 1900, bringing home a sweet-natured woman named Margaret whom Penelope welcomed with open arms. They built a small house on the eastern edge of the property, and Peter took over more of the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Thomas found himself enjoying this semi-retirement, still working but with more time to spend with Penelope. Patricia established a proper school in town, fighting the town council for funding and winning through sheer force of will that reminded everyone of her mother. She remained unmarried, claiming she was married to her work, though Penelope suspected her daughter simply had not met anyone who could match her fierce independence. The younger children followed their own paths, some staying near Reading, others venturing to Sacramento and beyond. But they all came home for holidays, filling the house with noise and laughter and grandchildren. In 1905, Thomas and Penelope celebrated their 28th anniversary quietly, just the two of them riding out to the spot where he had first brought her to see the ranch. The land had changed, more fences and buildings now, but the essential beauty remained. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is my life," Penelope said, dismounting with the ease of long practice. "That this all came from answering an advertisement and getting on a train." "That telegram nearly ended it before it started," Thomas said, helping her spread a blanket on the grass. "But I came anyway. 3 months later. Longest 3 months of my life." They sat together, sharing bread and cheese and apples, watching the cattle graze in the distance. Thomas was 56 now, Penelope 52, but they still felt young when they were together like this. "You think about what would have happened if I had not come?" Penelope asked. "If I had stayed in Boston after my father died, sometimes," Thomas admitted. "I think I would have eventually married someone else, probably. Built a comfortable, if not passionate life, but it would have been a pale shadow of what we have. I think I would have withered away in Boston," Penelope said. "Become one of those bitter old women who never took a chance on anything. Teaching would have saved me from the worst of it, probably, but I would have always wondered what might have been. We were lucky. We were brave," she corrected. "Both of us. You were brave enough to open your heart to a stranger through letters. I was brave enough to cross the country alone. We took risks, and they paid off." Thomas pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, now more silver than dark. "Best risk I ever took." The sun was setting as they rode home, painting the sky in the brilliant colors they had watched together thousands of times but never tired of seeing. The house came into view, lights already burning in the windows because Peter and Margaret were staying for dinner. Grandpa, Grandma. Their oldest grandchild, 5-year-old Thomas Jr., came running as soon as they rode up. "Papa said I could help feed the horses. Did he now?" Thomas said, swinging down from his saddle and scooping up his namesake. "Well then, we better get to it." Penelope watched her husband walk toward the barn with their grandchild chattering away, and her heart swelled with gratitude. This life, this family, this love, it was all more than she had ever dared to dream when she stepped off that stagecoach in Reading so many years ago. Margaret appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. "Dinner will be ready soon, Mama P." Penelope had asked her daughters-in-law and sons-in-law not to call her mother, as it made her feel ancient, so they had settled on Mama P, which she found charming. "Thank you, dear." "Do you need help?" "No. Patricia is already in there directing operations. You know how she is." Penelope laughed, knowing exactly how her eldest daughter could take over a kitchen. She headed inside, ready to navigate whatever minor conflicts were brewing over dinner preparations. The evening passed in the warm chaos that came with family gatherings. The children told stories, made plans, argued over nothing, and laughed until their sides hurt. Thomas sat at the head of the table, Penelope at his right hand, and watched their legacy unfold in the faces around them. Later, after everyone had left or gone to bed, Thomas and Penelope sat together on the porch as was their habit. The night was cool but not cold, the stars brilliant overhead. "We should take another trip," Penelope said suddenly. "Maybe to the coast. We have never seen the ocean together." "The ranch." "Peter can handle the ranch. We are not that old yet, Thomas. I want to see the ocean with you." He considered this, then nodded. "All right. In the spring, when the calving is done, we will go to the coast." She squeezed his hand, pleased with this small victory. They were always so busy with the ranch and the family that they rarely took time just for themselves. True to their word, they made the journey to the California coast that spring. They stood together on the beach, hand in hand, and watched the waves crash against the shore. The ocean was everything and nothing like Penelope expected, vast and powerful and beautiful. "It is magnificent," she breathed. "It is," Thomas agreed, but he was looking at her, not the water. They spent a week in a small coastal town, walking the beaches, eating fresh seafood, and rediscovering each other away from the responsibilities of ranch and family. It was like a second honeymoon, though they were older and grayer than during their first. On their last evening, they sat on the beach watching the sun set over the Pacific. The sky blazed with color, and the waves provided a gentle rhythm to the gathering darkness. "Thank you for this," Penelope said, "for agreeing to come." "Thank you for pushing me to do it," Thomas replied. "You were right. We needed this." "I am always right," she said with mock seriousness. "Yes, dear." She laughed and leaned into him, and they sat that way until the stars emerged and the night grew too cold to remain outside. The journey home took several days, and they arrived to find a small crisis brewing. One of the hired hands had quit suddenly, leaving them short-staffed during a critical time. Peter was trying to manage but was clearly overwhelmed. Thomas rolled up his sleeves and dove back into work as though he had never left. Penelope did the same, coordinating the household and the bookkeeping while Thomas handled the physical labor. They fell back into their partnership seamlessly, each knowing what the other needed without words. By the end of the week, the crisis was resolved, a new hand was hired, and life returned to normal. But something had shifted in Thomas and Penelope. The trip had reminded them that they were more than just ranchers and parents and grandparents. They were still Thomas and Penelope, the man and woman who had fallen in love through letters and built a life on faith. They made a pact to take time for themselves regularly, even if it was just riding out to watch the sunset or stealing an afternoon to read together. Life was short and precious, and they wanted to savor every moment they had left. In 1910, tragedy struck when Jacob Morrison died suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 58, and his death sent shockwaves through the community. Thomas grieved deeply for his oldest friend, the man who had welcomed him to Redding and stood by him through everything. Sarah was devastated, and Penelope spent weeks helping her friend manage the grief and the practical matters of running a ranch alone. Eventually, Sarah decided to sell the ranch and move in with her son James, who had a place in Sacramento. "Another piece of the old days gone," Thomas said the night after Sarah left Redding. "We are all getting older," Penelope said gently, "but we are still here, still together." "Promise me something," Thomas said suddenly, turning to face her. "Promise me that when my time comes, you will not give up. You will keep living, keep fighting, keep being the remarkable woman you are." "Thomas, do not talk like that. I need to hear you promise." She took his face in her hands, looking into the eyes she had loved for over 30 years. "I promise. But you have to promise me the same thing." "I promise." They held each other close, aware of their mortality in a way they had not been when they were younger. But awareness of death made them appreciate life even more. They treasured each day, each moment, each chance to be together. The years continued to pass. More grandchildren arrived, the ranch continued to prosper, and Thomas and Penelope grew older together with grace and gratitude. They had their share of health scares, aches and pains that came with age, but they faced everything together. In 1915, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together family and friends from across California. The house and yard were packed with people, all of them connected in some way to the life Thomas and Penelope had built, Peter stood up to make a toast, his own hair now showing gray. To my parents, who showed me what real love looks like. Who built something lasting not just in this ranch, but in this family and this community. Who taught me that taking risks for love is always worth it. Happy anniversary, Mom and Dad. Everyone raised their glasses, and Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. 40 years since that snowy January day when he had married a woman he barely knew but already loved. 40 years of building a life together, raising children, weathering storms, celebrating victories. Speech. Someone called and the crowd took up the chant. Thomas stood reluctantly, pulling Penelope up with him. "I am not good with words," he started, and the crowd laughed because everyone knew he was a man of action, not speeches. "But I can say this. 40 years ago, I took the biggest risk of my life when I answered yes at that altar. It turned out to be the best decision I ever made. Penelope, you have been my partner, my best friend, my greatest love. You took a chance on a lonely rancher in California, and you never looked back. I am grateful every day that you were brave enough to get on that train." Penelope was crying openly now. "And I am grateful every day that you were patient enough to wait for me, even when I sent that awful telegram. That you gave me a second chance when you had every right to turn me away." They kissed to thunderous applause, and the party continued late into the night. Thomas danced with Penelope, with his daughters and daughters-in-law, with his granddaughters. He talked with his sons and sons-in-law, with old friends and neighbors. He watched his legacy surround him and knew that he had lived a good life. As the party finally wound down and the last guests departed, Thomas and Penelope sat on their porch in the familiar silence. They were both exhausted but happy, their hearts full. 40 years, Penelope said wonderingly. "How did we get so lucky?" "We made our own luck," Thomas said. "We worked hard, loved hard, and never gave up on each other." "Never," she agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands as they had done for 4 decades. The ranch was quiet around them, most of the family either asleep in the house or heading home. The stars blazed overhead, indifferent and eternal. "You ever think about that day you arrived?" Thomas asked. "Walking into the general store." "All the time," Penelope said. "I was so scared. I thought you would take one look at me and send me packing. I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. You have said that before. It remains true," she laughed softly. "We have had a good life, Thomas Xavier." "The best life," he agreed, "and it is not over yet." "Not yet," she said, squeezing his hand. They sat together as the night deepened. Two people who had taken enormous risks for love and reaped rewards beyond measure. They had built a ranch, raised a family, and created a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. But more than any of that, they had found each other. Through letters and telegrams, through heartbreak and reunion, through 40 years of joys and sorrows, they had found each other and held on tight. And that, in the end, was the greatest achievement of all. The seasons turned as they always had, bringing their cycle of work and rest, growth and harvest. Thomas and Penelope settled into the rhythm of their later years with the same grace they had brought to every stage of their life together. They were slower now, their movements more careful, but their love remained as strong as ever. In 1918, the ranch celebrated its 50th year of operation. Peter threw a party to commemorate the occasion, insisting that his parents be honored for their incredible achievement. Half the county showed up, including the governor, who gave a speech about how families like the Xaviers represented the best of California's pioneer spirit. Thomas was embarrassed by all the attention, but Penelope glowed with pride. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, and they had built something that would last for generations. That winter was particularly harsh, and Thomas developed a cough that would not go away. Penelope nursed him through it, and by spring he seemed recovered, but he never quite regained his full strength. He was 70 now, and the years of hard physical labor were catching up with him. "I should slow down," he admitted to Penelope one evening. "You should," she agreed. "Let Peter handle more of the ranch work. You have earned a rest." "I do not know how to rest." "Then learn, I will teach you." And she did. They spent more time reading together, Thomas discovering a love for books he had never had time for before. They took gentle rides around the property, visiting their favorite spots and reminiscing about the years they had spent there. They played with their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on stories of the old days. Penelope's health remained good, though she too was slowing down. Her hair was completely silver now, and her hands were gnarled with arthritis, but her mind remained as sharp as ever. She still helped Patricia with the school, still managed the ranch books, still ran her lending library. On a warm evening in June 1920, they sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had done thousands of times before. The view never got old, the sky painting itself in brilliant colors as the sun dipped toward the horizon. "Do you remember," Penelope said, "when you first brought me here to see the ranch, before we were married?" "You cried when you saw the roses," Thomas said. "I cried because I could not believe someone would do that for me, plant roses just because I mentioned liking them in a letter. I would have planted a whole garden if you had asked. You did plant a whole garden, every spring for 45 years. Thomas took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Best thing I ever planted was roots with you." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat that way as the sun set and the stars emerged. The house behind them was quiet, just the two of them tonight, their children and grandchildren scattered across California and beyond. "I am tired," Thomas admitted. "More tired than I have ever been." "I know," Penelope said softly. "Me too. But I am happy, so incredibly happy. So am I." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying scents of earth and growing things. This land, this place, this home they had built together. "I love you," Thomas said, the words as natural as breathing. "I love you too," Penelope replied. "Always and forever." Thomas Xavier died peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, with Penelope holding his hand and their children gathered around. He was 71 years old and had lived a full, rich life. The funeral was attended by hundreds, a testament to the impact he had made on his community. Penelope grieved but did not break. She had promised Thomas she would keep living, and she honored that promise. She moved into a small cottage on the property, giving Peter and Margaret the main house. She continued her work with the library and the school, continued spending time with her family, continued living with purpose and grace. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch of her cottage and look out at the ranch, remembering. She would think about the telegram that almost ended everything before it began. She would think about showing up 3 months later, terrified and determined. She would think about Thomas waiting for her, hurt but willing to give her a chance. Most of all, she would think about the life they had built together. The children they had raised, the legacy they had created, the love they had shared. It had not always been easy, but it had always been worth it. Penelope lived another 12 years, dying peacefully in 1932 at the age of 79. She was buried next to Thomas on a hillside overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the years of their lives. But their true legacy was not in stone. It was in the thriving ranch that Peter and his children continued to operate. It was in the school that Patricia had built into one of the finest in the region. It was in the dozens of grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their blood and their values into the future. It was in the story that became legend in Reading, about the mail-order bride who sent a telegram saying she could not come, then showed up anyway 3 months later. About the rancher who had every right to turn her away but chose to give her a chance. About two people who took enormous risks for love and built something beautiful from their courage. The Xavier Ranch still stands today, run by the 5th generation of the family. The original house has been preserved, and visitors can see the rose bushes that still bloom near the porch, descendants of the ones Thomas planted all those years ago. And on quiet evenings, when the sun sets over the California hills painting the sky in brilliant colors, it is easy to imagine two figures sitting on that porch. A man and a woman who found each other against all odds and held on tight. Who built a life of love and purpose and left the world better than they found it. Their love story began with letters and a telegram, with risk and courage and second chances. It continued through 45 years of marriage, through joys and sorrows, through building a family and a legacy. And it lives on still, in the land they loved, in the family they created, in the example they set for taking chances on love. Thomas and Penelope Xavier proved that sometimes the greatest rewards come from the biggest risks. That love is worth fighting for, worth crossing a continent for, worth building a life around. They showed that a telegram saying no does not have to be the end of the story. That showing up anyway, even 3 months late, even scared and uncertain, can be the beginning of something beautiful. And they demonstrated that a life built on love, partnership, and courage is a life well lived. Their story is over now, their time on earth complete. But the love they shared, the family they built, the legacy they created continues on. In the ranch that still bears their name, in the descendants who still tell their story, in the lesson they taught about taking risks for love, Thomas waited for his bride. She sent a telegram saying she could not come. But she showed up anyway, 3 months later, and together they built something that will last forever. That is the power of love. That is the beauty of second chances. That is the legacy of Thomas and Penelope Xavier, pioneers of California, builders of dreams, and proof that true love can overcome any obstacle if both people are brave enough to try.